Welcome to the Grace and Grit podcast, made for women who want their healthiest years to be ahead of them, not behind them. Join your host, Courtney Townley, right now as she breaks down the fairy tale health story you have been chasing all of your life into sensible action steps and lasting change. Hello, and welcome to the Grace and Grit podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I always appreciate your listenership. So if you listened in last episode, you know that the theme on the podcast this month is nourish, and we are talking all things food. So in episode 1, I introduced the concept of food philosophy, really understanding your own beliefs around food so you can better align yourself with those beliefs. And also to question if those are even beliefs you want to keep, like, are they working for you? And today, I'm super excited because I've invited Miss Mary Miller Brooks to the show to share some of her incredible knowledge about how food affects our physiology and what we can do to nourish our bodies on a deeper level. Now, I first met Mary about 3 years ago. We were at a business conference together in San Diego, and we were just casually introduced to each other. And when I got home, I, connected with her on her social media channels, and I've been following her ever since. And I've got to say, I love this woman. I recently invited her to participate in the summit that we are hosting next month called Confident Women Rising. So stay tuned for that. And I loved so much what she had to say in our interview that I asked her if she would be willing to come on the podcast and go even another layer down. So Mary has the amazing ability to take complicated topics and break them down into very digestible bites. She is smart, and she really has a deep passion for helping people to heal their food challenges, specifically the things that are disrupting their gut, their thyroid, and their adrenal health. So just to give you a little quick blurb from her professional bio, Mary Brooks is the owner and creator of Sustainable Nutrition and the Fuel Better Formula Method. She has a master's degree in nutrition from the University of Virginia, and she's a certified functional health coach. And prior to creating her own company, she worked for 25 years in the healthcare industry. She specializes in solving the root cause of fatigue and low energy, which I know can be a huge problem in this particular community. And she also specializes in the unique nutrition needs of endurance athletes and has coached several athletes to national and world-class podium finishes. She's based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and she helps clients all over the U.S. So Mary, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I love the work that you do, and I love being around you.
Thank you. And I'm so happy to have you here because I know that I have reaped so much value from knowing you and being exposed to your work. And I just know my audience members are going to get so much value from having you here and also having you a part of the summit.
Hey, thank you.
Yes. Before we go any further, I would love for you to explain what a functional health coach is, because I think a lot of people, we hear that word tossed around a lot lately, functional medicine, functional health coaching. What is it exactly when we talk about functional?
So what I would say a functional nutritionist does that's different than a nutritionist is really look at the whole person. What are their emotions? What are their needs? What is their environment? How did they get here? Instead of just saying, oh, we need to add these calories or these macros or these fat grams, we're looking at you as a human being sort of like traveling through time and all the experiences that add up to sort of get us to where we are. So whole person, whole body, whole human approach.
Which I love so much because obviously, we're kind of living at a time, a day and age where there's so many cookie cutter protocols out there, something that works for somebody else's life. And those measures, while they very well may have worked for somebody else's life, it's not your life. And your life has a unique set of challenges and, a different history and even a little bit of a different biology, right? All of our DNA is not the same.
Right. So, what I love to say is, if you and I sit down and eat the exact same plate of food, we would think, okay, that's the same plate of food, right? But it's not, because we have a different microbiome. We have different genetics. We have different environments. We have different ancestry. We have different stress loads. We may be at different places in our cycle. I think that's another thing that a lot of times, when we look at a diet, a lot of time that's a trickle down from a male dynamic, like a male model. A lot of that is. It's not necessarily for a female. And then look at, where we are. So you premenopause, perimenopause, menopause, but also just even like where you are in your cycle. And I think that's really exciting for us, to look at food as not something that is one size fits all, that we knew that deep down that we are kind of special snowflakes, but it gives us a permission to say, oh my gosh, this gives so much more depth and nuance and texture and flexibility, to make it work for us.
Absolutely. And I also love the idea that to really approach, sort of the uniqueness of someone's life, you have to partner with them to better understand and be able to kind of assess and recommend things, where a lot of protocols are just kind of dictating to somebody what to do without getting any of that feedback.
Yeah, and it's really tough. I will probably get into this more, but in our culture right now, the way that we're learning about any type of food trend, Americans are very trendy anyway, right? But we'll see something on Instagram, or we'll see a result, or we'll see, a few little catchphrases. And what we're only seeing is like above, like that, truly the tip of the iceberg, the little things that, we look at that and we think, oh, okay, I could cut these calories, or I could do this particular diet. But underneath is really who we are. It's our emotions, it's our experience, it's our trauma, it's our stress, it's all of those things that don't really get asked. And at least for me, that's what I want people to consider, because those are bigger levers to pull, your sleep and all those other things. If you're only talking about, shaving down 10 or 20 or 30 calories or 100 calories, that's not a lot to work with, right? But you get into those other more deep issues, the ones that we didn't really want to touch, but that's where really the more profound and the long-lasting changes happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, so true. Well, I know that you have a pretty interesting story, because you had thyroid cancer about 10 years ago.
Right.
Will you speak a little bit to that and how it maybe shifted or deepened your practice or what you believe as a health practitioner?
Talk about sort of the messenger that I didn't ask for, that, was like a pretty profound teacher to me. When you have something like that happen, you do a lot of inward, looking inward and looking backwards. You'll never really know all the answers, but of course, it caused me to ask a lot of questions. And those questions did not get asked by the conventional medicine system at all. So a lot of what I do is really out of my dismay over that I saw the best doctors, I saw the best endocrinologists. I, for a while, felt like I was just like walking around town with my chart, going from person, place to place to place. And in all that time, no one asked the questions that I now ask. So if I have to go back in time, I was, probably a little stressed out as a kid, but I didn't really make anything of that. That was just kind of it's how you grow up. So that's
it felt normal to you. Sure.
Right. Felt normal to me. And the way that I adapted to that stress was to try to be as good as I possibly could and work as hard as I possibly could at every single thing I ever did. And probably a lot of your audience
can relate. Absolutely.
Relate to that. So on top of that sort of personality trait, so there was that. Then I did have 3 children under the age of 2.5. So I had a toddler then I had a set of twins.
Oh, that's not stressful at all, Mary.
No. No. And then I did go through a pretty a pretty harsh divorce. It was just, there was a lot of, sort of drawn out, whatever, trauma and drama around that. So, okay. And then the other piece of it was that for a period of time when my twins were really little, I started to it would go like cold, sinus infection, bronchitis, pneumonia. And for a period of about a year and a half, I don't even know how many antibiotics and steroids. It was just this cycle. So it's my belief that it was probably the combination of the high stress, high cortisol. I was a very high intensity exerciser, runner, spinner, workout in the gym, you name it, I did it. The children being that close in age, probably big pull on my thyroid. And then the antibiotics and the steroids, which would have been hard on my gut. Didn't know any of that at the time. Yeah. So, had radiation. Had my thyroid taken out, had radiation, but that's really when the bottom fell out. Like everyone was like, oh, great, you survived cancer. And I was like, yep, super. But I felt like I had felt great before, and then I felt terrible afterwards. So it was that experience of me sort of swimming back through that caused me to basically lay down that system that I now take people through, which is going back and remediating and addressing all those things that happened to me that I never really took care of.
Yeah. And it's always so fascinating for me to hear stories, right? Because we all have those stories about, not being able to get the help that we needed at the time, and then sort of taking responsibility for our own situation in whatever ways we could. And, not that that's easy, but sometimes it's just necessary. And, the time that you were experiencing all of this, there probably wasn't the help that maybe there is now in a little bit. Like, I think that what you do, I know is very unique. And yet it's maybe being talked about more than it was 10 years ago.
I think so. I think that there are a lot more women that are aware that there has been a cumulative effect of things that they have done. And they're kind of not looking for, and I assume this is your community too, they're not looking for the quick fix anymore. They're not looking to that anymore. They're cautious about just saying, oh, I have a symptom, I'll just take a medication for it. I probably was right in the center of a group of people who didn't do that, that just did everything that conventional medicine said, that, we took every product that came down the pike. I didn't question taking things like antibiotics and steroids. And I do think, though, when we have that awareness, we realize that we might do something, 5 years back, and it doesn't impact our health until 5 years later.
Which is tricky, isn't it? Because I think a lot of us tell ourselves we're getting away with it, right? Like with its food choices or high levels of stress, because we may not feel the effects right away.
Well, you just hit a really profound thing, which is when we're in that state, our body gifts us, I think, adrenaline and cortisol and all that.
Yeah, I'll help you get through
and
this.
It feels pretty good. You're like,
sure.
Yeah, you're right. You're like, this is okay. Like I'm doing well. And then what typically happens is there'll be that straw, there'll be a stressful event. There'll be something, a virus sometimes, but often it really is just one more stressful event. And then you realize that your immune system was dampened all that time when you were overperforming and over-delivering and over-giving and overdoing. That's when the crisis happens, right?
Exactly. It's so true. And it's interesting too, I find that just the lack of patience in healing our systems, because I talk to women all the time who are like, well, I left that toxic relationship 4 weeks ago. Why aren't I feeling better? Or I quit the job, or whatever the dramatic change is that they made. That's wonderful. But it takes your body time to heal, especially when it's been abused or overstressed for so many years.
Right. There's an analogy, and I think it applies, but I love it. So, do you remember when your children were teething that they might have been cranky or off, and all of a sudden you see the tooth?
Yes.
You see the tooth that they're teething, but you see the tooth. But that whole time, there was like an ice cube coming through that skin. Well, we didn't know it, right?
Yeah.
And then you see it and you're like, oh, now I can appreciate what you're going through. But all that time, that thing was like working itself through through the surface. And a lot of times we are just so caught up and bound up. And our culture is so right now oriented towards the hustle and the grind and the go and the overdo and like the whole like warrior culture.
It's so true. I had a mentor tell me years ago, and I loved this because I've carried it with me for so long. She said, your body is always talking to you. And initially, your body tries to get your attention by just kind of throwing pebbles at you. Yep. You might have a little weird ache or pain. You might have a little bloat. You might get a little headache.
Yes.
And because you're so busy and don't have time to deal with the things, your body has to get a little louder. And so it starts throwing the rocks. And if those get ignored, it becomes the boulders.
Yes.
And I've always thought, that is so true because a lot of us, and I see this a lot, especially as we go into our 40s, right? And beyond, that, my body just is changing so much because now I'm in this age bracket. And it's like, well, yes, hormones are shifting, but at the same time, we've also been making certain decisions for decades now that are starting to catch up with us.
Yeah.
So it's a combination.
Yeah. I had to really change my mentality around that because I will tell you that my first response when I found out that I had, cancerous nodules on my thyroid, my first word was disappointment. I thought of all the things that I had a tiger by the tail on, it was my body. My body had two pregnancies that produced 3 healthy children. Anything that I ever set my mind to physically, I was capable of doing, within these.
Sure.
I felt like I had this real sense of like, when I knew like not to take medications or whatever, I felt like I knew my body. So I was like, how did that happen? And part of me was like, and what else do I not know that I had this? But later I really thought about it a lot. And I thought, like you just said, my body was trying to get my attention. Think of all the things that it had done for me when I wasn't listening. Mm-hmm. And it was just I felt like it was my wake up call, like, okay, I'll listen to you now. And instead of this whole like kill cancer thing or beat cancer, I was like, well, I have a different feeling. I'm sort of like, we're in partnership, we're in this together. And I kind of have to now listen when I don't feel good or if I need to rest or if I'm pushing too hard. And I do ask myself, like, what kind of collision course was I on that I never would have gotten off of if I hadn't had that? Does that make sense?
Definitely. Well, there's always that silver lining, right? Even in something that you would never wish on anybody, but it did bring you a level of knowledge that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And now you're carrying that forward and helping so many women. Yeah. So you just mentioned a few things that I think are so relevant to most people listening today, which is just kind of fatigue and low energy. And I think it's relevant to our culture at large. I think we have a sleep crisis in our country. People aren't sleeping enough. But then you compound not sleeping enough with the, women 40 plus going through hormonal shifts. And it almost compounds the problem. And so I would love for you to speak a little bit to the energy challenges of this age and stage of life. And what are some of the things that women could be doing to maybe help remedy that struggle of constantly feeling tired all the time? Because that is your body telling you that something's not being met. There's a need that's not being met.
Right. So I think I would break down the like why we're so tired and kind of like what we can do about it into 3 categories. One we talked about a little bit already, which is just kind of our culture of overachievement, hustle, not being able to sit still, not being able to not overachieve, overperform, overdeliver. I think that's number one. So developing habits and rituals and routines around rest and stillness and mindfulness, because, the human brain travels forward and backwards in time and is rarely ever present. So number one, I think, is just resisting what the culture tells you about you always have to be doing and being and going and turned on, and like literally learning how to power down. I think that's number one.
I love that, learning how to power down. Okay.
Yeah. The second is really around blood sugar. And it's interesting. I think that, women in particular have issues around blood sugar, often because of dieting, often because we never really learned, to your word, nourishment. We never really learned how to listen to our bodies. If you really think, go around and ask people, what was the first thing they learned about food? It's frightening to hear what people were told by their moms, by magazines, it's sad, so I think, but blood sugar for women is really critical. You have a lot of us in insulin resistance because we've dieted or we've restricted. And then what happens? You restrict and then you overeat or you undereat or you skip meals, or, a lot of women in their 40s, let's face it, they're on kind of the coffee, sugar, and wine diet.
Yeah. So sugar, and sugar, plus stress, which also creates a blood sugar problem.
Correct.
Yeah. So it's a dangerous recipe.
Right. And without getting into we don't want to get into that whole thing of like a particular diet, but I do think we know that as we age, we don't handle carbohydrates as well.
Yes.
Thank you. We have to be mindful. And it's tricky because women are stressed. So you're not careful with your blood sugar. And then what do? You're just so tired that you're going to reach for the sweet thing because you need
energy.
You need the energy, or it's emotional. You haven't dealt with your emotions. You haven't been still. You haven't been aware. And so where people are very mindless with their eating.
And I also think there's a level of satisfaction that women aren't getting in the rest of their life. And so they reach for sugar and wine as false pleasures. It's like that thing that immediately makes us feel better. Unfortunately, it has negative consequences.
Yeah, you nailed it. And it's so interesting because when I started my business, I have a conventional, nutrition degree. I was in corporate health, doing all these health screenings with women. I've done dozens and dozens of them. And I thought, I'm just going to be letting people know that the blueberry muffin at Dunkin' Donuts is too high fat. They must not know that. And they just need to eat a little more broccoli. Like I literally was that girl who thought it was that simple. It wasn't until I saw women in the workplace, I was like, they're not gaining weight because they don't know any better. They're gaining weight because they are stressed and they don't have emotional support and they don't have all these tools. That's when I realized, like, oh my gosh, like how foolish is that, just to say like, oh, you realize, you're eating the wrong thing. It's so much more complicated than that. So I really feel like a lot of this lives in the mental and emotional health.
Definitely. I agree with you so much. So what's the third thing? You said learning how to power down, learning how to stabilize blood sugar, and what else?
I think the whole level of like, and I'll sort of group toxins, like what we are consuming in our body, the level of, toxins that we are exposed to. And I would say just like kind of our environment, but I'll sort of put all of that under like toxins, just lowering our toxic load. I think those three things add up to, why we don't get enough sleep, why we're not taking good care, of our diet and exercise during the day, why we're constantly overwhelmed.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So that trifecta, that's such a powerful trifecta, right? Learning how to take responsibility for stress, which is why we need to learn how to rest, learning how to stabilize blood sugar, and lowering our total toxic load.
Yeah. And so when you think about that, when we, said, why is it, that's more hormonal than it is calories.
Of course.
Right. I mean, all of that, if you dig down to it, that it does affect your cortisol. It does affect your thyroid. It does affect, your, how balanced your hormones are. And that I think what we're dealing with are people who have probably, as you said, they've had hormonal issues for years and years and years. And then it just, everything is cumulative. And then, suddenly they feel tired.
Right. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the diet and fitness industry has kind of hyper-focused on this piece of the health equation, which is energy in, energy out, which is, yes, a piece of specifically, right, like fat loss in particular. But your body can't even hear that messaging if your hormones are out of whack.
Right.
So hormonal health is definitely the name of the game.
I think it's, hormones and emotions. I think if you come up to someone and they say, here, do this, and they're not addressing those, don't bother.
Of course. Yeah. Right. It's like you got to build that foundation first before you go on to more complicated things, if you even need those things.
Right.
Yeah. You may not realize this, but we are celebrating the 200th episode of the Grace and Grit podcast in just a couple of weeks. And as part of the celebration, I thought it would be super fun to give you, the listeners, an opportunity to share how the Grace and Grit podcast has influenced your life. So, if you love this podcast and you are willing to share a few words about how it's made a difference in your life, head on over to graceandgrit.com/voicemail and leave me a voice message. I'm going to compile these voice messages into a really fun podcast celebration for our 200th episode. And everyone who leaves a voice message will also be entered to win Grace and Grit swag and even some private coaching sessions with me. So once again, you can head on over to graceandgrit.com/voicemail and tell me how the Grace and Grit podcast has impacted your health and ultimately your life. Let's talk about food mapping, because I know this is something that you offer your clients. I know it's something that you're very confident in. And I think it's something that a lot of people don't know a lot about. We hear about food intolerances. We certainly hear about food allergies. But what is food mapping exactly?
Right. Okay. So we'll back up just a tiny bit.
Sure.
And I didn't really talk about gut health, but
yes,
I know your community probably knows a lot about it. But
we can't hear it enough. So lay it on us.
Well, and when we were talking about you and me with the 2 plates of food, clearly a lot of the way the food is going to impact us is because we are incredibly diverse when it comes to our own microbiome. So it only makes sense that each of our microbiomes is different. So what we've been told for decades and decades and decades, eat less, exercise more, or these foods are bad, or these foods are good. We've never really looked at the individual when it comes to that. So for me, especially if I'm dealing with someone who is tired, who can't get a good night's sleep, a lot of people who I help have known digestive issues, the bloating, the IBS, the Crohn's, the colitis. Of course, most thyroid issues are autoimmune, which come from the gut. So you always want to look at how is each person actually reacting to food. And the question we never ask is, we might ask, we ask someone to go on an elimination diet, which I personally feel like is a lot.
It's a big ask.
It's a big ask. I'm in this business. So I don't think I could do it. It's because you really talk about taking all those foods out and then putting them all back in. That could take 300 days. That's
right.
That's a lot. So we know that if you are not able to digest a food, and this is what's sneaky about it, and the type of food testing that I do looks at what we call the low and slow food intolerances. So you wouldn't necessarily know. Let's say you're eating a food that, for example, I do enough of these tests. What's a food group, a particular nut that all of us are eating all the time that we never ate before or didn't eat a lot?
Almonds.
Thank you. Okay. So we went from hardly ever eating them to eating them all the time.
All the time.
Not only
almond flour, almond milk, it's everywhere.
Okay, so there you go. There is an example of a food that you can give yourself an intolerance to because you've eaten it so much and you've eaten it sometimes to the exclusion of other foods. But what we all thought it was healthy, right? So everyone eats it, but it's not everyone can digest it. And when you eat it day after day after day, you can have a food intolerance to it. So doing food mapping, I think, is really helpful because you can find those potential culprits that could be causing the headache, that could be causing the bloating, that could be causing cravings, that could be causing, digestive issues. And it's really nice to know that because, in my opinion, I don't want people to be afraid of food. I don't want them to say, I can't eat all these foods because diversity in the diet is really critical.
Yes.
We still probably, with the microbiome, we're still in infancy stages, right?
Understanding it.
Right. But we know that we developed it because we had all this exposure to plants from, root to stem or whatever. Like we were eating all those parts. And now look at the average person probably eats like 2 vegetables.
If that, yeah.
Broccoli and carrots. Like, thank you to the meal prep people.
Yeah.
Gave us that, that concept. So food mapping really is a way to say, do I have any unique intolerances that I would not have known? And then what I prefer to do is take them out for a period of time, not forever. Mm-hmm. Some of them probably will not be coming back, but sometimes you can kind of cool things off, let the body recalibrate, and then reintroduce a limited number of those so that then you can say, okay, can I tolerate some of them? Like you can actually know which ones you can tolerate and which ones you can't. And also the food mapping can tell you some other trends. Like I look at them enough that I can tell if someone has a leaky gut or if it's like a tendency towards candida. Yeah. So they can be really, really helpful.
Will you explain what leaky gut is actually? Because I think it's a much more prevalent problem than we originally kind of thought. Like a lot of people are suffering from leaky gut. And it's one of those things that you could have that you have no idea you have.
Right. I mean, I'm probably a classic example. And like the biggest myth is that if you had a leaky gut, you would know.
Right.
That's what everybody says. Like I remember the first time I ever saw ads for probiotics, I was like, well, I don't need that. I'm not bent over. I don't have cramping. I don't have any of that. So that's like the first misconception. And one thing to know about the gut is that it's the only organ system of the body that's kind of separate from the body, if that makes sense. Like it runs from your mouth to the anus, but everything is kept kind of inside of it. It doesn't have
contained, yeah,
a blood flow that runs all the way through it. So
okay.
The workhorse of the body is really the intestinal wall. That's when it's not the stomach, but it's within the intestine. So leaky gut is 2 things really. We talk about intestinal permeability, which means that this barrier basically that keeps the good things, the things that the body needs will be allowed to like come across the gut wall. But the things that the body says, I don't need this, I don't like this is not for me, stays within the intestine and passes through.
Okay.
So intestinal permeability means that that's not working. That things that should stay inside that tube are actually passing into the bloodstream. Okay. So
which can also be things like hormones, right? Like hormones that should stay in the intestine for elimination are actually getting pushed back into the bloodstream.
Well, yeah. So that, when you look at, it's so funny. I thought after my children were little, I wouldn't be talking about poop anymore, but
little did you know.
Little did I know. This is one of the most fascinating things to me. And you go to your regular physician, they'll ask you more about whether your parents had glaucoma than they do about your own bowel habits.
Right.
They don't ask you. So the number of women that walk around with constipation who only go to the bathroom once every few days, once a week, what is happening to them is that instead of those toxins, because yes, you recycle your hormones or you eliminate your hormones through the gut and through the liver, instead of those excess hormones being passed out, you're actually reabsorbing them.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody tells us this.
Right.
right? So everybody needs to be pooping once, twice a day because you just are not eliminating toxins. And then you have that toxic burden, right? And you don't need to do them with cleanses and all these quickie things. Your body literally can eliminate normally. And I help people with that every single day.
Yeah. I mean, it blows my mind, right? That we have so many amazing built-in detox mechanisms. And yet we feel like we need to like supercharge it or, do something to really make it work well. And yes, treat your body well. Absolutely. That's what's going to help those systems work. But decongesting the liver and having regular bowel movements are two of the most powerful things you could be pursuing in order to detox your body effectively.
Right. So, I mean, I always say you've basically got 4 exit rows of the body, right? You pee, you poop, you have your skin and your lungs. And there are things that we can be doing every single day to detoxify without a single potion, pill, gimmick.
Yes. I love that you bring up the skin too, because I was just reading an article the other day about, kind of benefits of cardio that we're just really not considering that much.
I'm glad you're saying this.
Yeah. And the benefit of sweating, especially for the lymphatic system, is immense. So you speak to that because you're way better, more versed on this than I am.
I'm glad you're saying that. So, but before I forget on the gut, so it's intestinal permeability and gut dysbiosis. So the other thing that can happen is that the cells that line the gut, instead of being tight, think of them like a little fence, like knit together. Those little spaces open up. So it would be like if you and your neighbor had a gate, and if the gate was working, their dog wouldn't run out. But what's happening in our guts is those spaces are opening. And so things are coming into the bloodstream that shouldn't be there. And over time, that's inflammation. So a certain amount of that your body can handle, but a certain amount of it you cannot. And wherever you tend to have a problem, whether that's your thyroid, whether that's your gut, whether that's your joints, whether that's your headaches, whether that's your sleep, that's inflammation hitting you at your weakest link.
And inflammation, I think it's important for everyone to hear, we know is the precursor to disease in the human body. Chronic inflammation. Acute inflammation, not, cutting your finger and having some swelling, fine. That's good. That's how we
actually, that's good. Like some acute inflammation is actually good.
But having the chronic inflammation over time because of the things we're exposing our biology to is not so good. And it basically causes your body to kind of attack itself.
Right. So going back to your question, we are probably inflamed at a much higher level than any other generation because of, the demands that are on women today, the way our culture is. Our food is different. It just is. We have... it's tough, to avoid all processed foods. It's tough, and then, we're busy. So we feel like, we're too busy to cook. Like there's a lot of stuff around food that's just really complicated and toxins. So yes, like all of that inflammation stacks and stacks and stacks. And then we have, and we basically you can't explain where we are through genetics. Like, our genes don't evolve that fast. So it's basically, right?
Yeah.
Don't. Right. So we've added chemicals, we've added stress, we've changed our food. And I think it hits women the hardest.
Yeah. It's definitely, and this is great stuff. This is great stuff to hear. So let's back up and, because I want to make sure you address the skin thing. The sweating.
The sweating. I'm so glad you said that because the heat of sweating or heat and sweat are basically one of our simplest, most profound ways to remove heavy metals, pesticides, plastics, increase circulation, but basically remove things from our body. And it's interesting because I love strength training, but I think part of the reason why we're hearing only about strength training is because it's only about body composition.
Yeah. And also I think with the osteoporosis and things, like there's more talk of that these days of the bone density, but I'm with you because I'm one of those people, I've almost joked for years, like I am not going to run from anything unless it's a bear chasing me, right? Like I've never really loved cardio, although I do love to dance. That's like my drug of choice. But I will tell you that now that I understand the detoxifying power of heat and sweat,
Yep.
you know, bet your bottom dollar I'm going to be doing a lot more cardio.
It's a good acute stress. I mean, you can also do sauna. You can do contrast showers, like when you take hot to cold. We're going to hear a lot more about how cold therapy, that we were meant to be exposed to cold. But just think about anything that is a short acute stress. Like this is another kind of random little fact. But, you know, when we think about food that has been put under stress, I'm not talking about an animal that's put under stress.
Sure.
But a plant that has to thrive in a tricky climate because it develops things like pigmentation, all these things that were meant to protect us.
Yeah.
Right? So we need to just think, I am a big plant fanatic and I've always loved nature. But I just think whenever you think about how nature has these cycles, remember that the human body does too.
Yeah, definitely. So important to know and remember and practice.
Right. And we have a lot, like the more we are connected to nature, and that's another reason why we're tired, is that we are so disconnected from nature. So all these little things that we're talking about, like the highly pigmented food, sweating, like some things that we are being told to do are so fancy and so expensive, only available to certain people. I really hope I'm talking about things that don't fall in that category.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And nutrition is just so much bigger than food itself, right? Like, yes, food matters, of course, but so does sun exposure and getting out into nature and all the sweating and all these things we're talking about. So I want to, before we wrap this up, I do want to address fiber, because I know this is something that you have sort of proposed as like a fourth macronutrient that women need. Macronutrients being things like protein, carbs, and fats. So why is fiber so important?
So this is my first time of maybe proposing the fourth macronutrient.
I love it. I think it's great because I love talking about fiber. I think it's so important.
And by the way, when I say fiber, I don't mean like a fiber bar or some, fiber pill that you're getting. So
fiber from whole food sources.
Right. Vegetables.
Yes.
So I think as a culture, most women will talk about, like, they probably know how many grams of fat are in something or how many grams of protein. But the missing link is often fiber. So when we talk about the microbiome, for example, the way that you keep your microbiome alive is for it to feed off of plants.
Yes, it's a prebiotic, right?
Prebiotic. And it needs, that is part of the reason why our guts aren't very happy, is because we just aren't eating very many vegetables. And like I said, most people only eat one or two. Mm-hmm. So diversity in like all of those different vegetables, not just spinach, but bok choy and arugula and all the different vegetables. But when you look at a meal, and I think the other thing is, like, maybe we all know kind of like the Weight Watchers model, like, oh, the vegetables are free because they're low calorie. That's not the point. The point is they give us so many benefits. But if you're looking to regulate blood sugar or you take a meal, it's the fiber that really allows that blood sugar to be more stable.
Because it's slower to absorb. Is that why it enters your stream a little slower?
Yep.
Yeah.
And it takes a while for the body to break it down. But it's so, even as I'm saying this, I feel like we only know that from the standpoint of dieting. We don't think of it about like the benefit to like our microbiome and to our, insulin and to our,
your bowel movements.
Hello. Right. Like all these people trying to drink so much water.
Yeah.
Eat your vegetables.
Exactly.
So much water
in vegetables.
Right.
Yeah, eat your water. That's what I always say. Yes.
Yeah. So I think that, and also too, for hormone health, you can't detoxify if you are not using those vegetables to bind excess hormones. So when you think about digestion, always remember that the liver is the quarterback of the digestion. And all of those vegetables are so helpful to the liver. So think about asparagus, artichokes, parsley, cilantro, what else? Arugula, like the deeper, those really support the liver. And that is so profoundly helpful to that whole hormonal equation.
Absolutely. And we can't support those hormones enough, ladies.
Right. So, I mean, I think everyone should at least once a day have this big bowl of cruciferous vegetables, the Brussels sprouts, what else? The bok choy, the cabbage, the cauliflower. And don't forget the herbs. I think the herbs are often overlooked and they're so simple and easy to get into the diet and have like profound effects.
Awesome. Yeah, we just need to simplify and get back to, I think getting back to nature in general would just be so beneficial on so many levels.
Yeah. So one of the things I tell people all the time, because they're like, where do I start?
Yeah.
If you have a farmer's market.
Yes.
Go to your farmer's market.
Yeah.
Because whatever is in season, whatever is locally grown is going to be the freshest, and also like what you were more, naturally, they're better for you because they're in season, not just because they're fresher, but you're a seasonal creature too. And you'll see like, oh, okay, apples in the fall, cabbage, the cruciferous vegetables in the fall, the spring vegetables in the spring. Those literally are the easiest and the best for your body. And they taste amazing.
So true. Oh, this has been so good. And I could talk to you for hours.
I know.
I am going to wrap this up because I know our listeners only have so much time. So I would love for you, before you go, just to share with listeners how they can find out more about you, where are the spaces and places online they can check you out.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you so much. So my website is fuelbetterformula.com. And I'm also on Facebook as, I think it's Mary Brooks Sustainable Nutrition. I know that's a little confusing.
And we'll put all the links on the page where this is housed so people can figure it out.
Different names. But those are the best places to find me. And I typically help people either with, autoimmune issues, or I run some programs around either like high cortisol or just getting your energy back into balance.
I love it. Yeah, I love it. I love you. I love the work you're doing in the world. I just think you're it's just so good you exist because this is so sensible. It's so practical. Like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I feel like your zone of genius is taking some really complicated, confusing topics and just really simplifying it to make it tangible and applicable. Like, how do we apply these behavior changes? And you're really great at that. So thank you for that.
I mean, I love what you do, but I want this so much for us as women to be the own stewards of our body, to know that we are wise, that it doesn't have to be fancy and complicated. It does take a change in thinking.
Yeah.
It really does.
And it requires patience.
Yeah.
Right?
That's you got to get out of that. Every time you see something like, change this in a weekend, just know that that's not true.
Yeah. And 30 days after 30 years of treating your body a certain way, it's not a very long period of time, right? Like, we got to go at this for the long haul. And I know you're all about that, which is, again, why I so appreciate you. So for those of you listening today, I just want you to know that, again, I interviewed Mary for the upcoming summit, Confident Women Rising. So you'll definitely be able to get more exposure to her there. And just before this interview, we were talking about doing some kind of Q&A session within the Women of Grace and Grit Facebook community, maybe towards the end of the month. So if you're not already a part of that community, now's a great time to join so you can stay abreast of future offerings like that. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, your energy, and just your mission.
The same back to you. I love what you're doing. It's always fun to hang out with you.
Thank you for listening to the Grace and Grit podcast. It is time to mend the fabric of the female health story. And it starts with you taking radical responsibility for your own self-care. You are worth the effort. And with a little grace and grit, anything is possible.